killer. Yeah. Gotta be a killer. What you gotta do for what you want. I'm talking about necessarily telling nobody, right? But you gotta get them to get happy. Let them talk. You be a killer. What you do? Nobody stop.
Mr. Killer, just a killer. Yeah, nigga, I kill him. Show no mercy or feeling. Nothing very revealing. People say that I'm illin' like pass them the penicillin. The wall giving me limits. The sky is my ceiling to die for what I'm living. Lord knows I'm about that. I'll be right back and come back with a nice strap. Till I collapse, I be hated until I'm buried. And even after that, these hating niggas still scare me. It's so much to live for, so much to kill for, so much to destroy, so much to see grow.
Let's continue. Because it's simple, it's plain, it's real clear, cut, and dry. But we're going to dive into it and get some more evidences for the non-believers. All right. First and foremost, I want to give all praise, honor, and glory to the Most High God, Yahweh. Do so by Hashem Yahweh Shai. Right? It's your brother Kayala coming to you with something that is much needed. Right? We're going to dive into some very, very crucial information in regards to the foundational doctrine of the Hebrew Israelites. Right? The Israelite community teaches this on a majority scale. However, there's not a lot of information that dives into what we're about to dive into at the depth at which we're about to dive into it. So without further ado, let me go ahead and share my screen so that way we can get right into it. All right. So the prophetic lineage of Esau. Today we're going to be taking a look at some forensic examination. Right, we're going to be tracing the lineage from Esau, starting around the 18th century BC through millennia of history to a specific modern people group. Right, there are some people that say, oh, well, you know, Esau is the Arab. Oh, Esau is a so-called white man. Oh, Esau doesn't exist anymore. Oh, Esau was just, there's a lot of speculation, right? But again, nobody really goes into the history of who Esau is today, right? So those identified as Caucasians is who we very firmly believe are Edomites today, or descendants of Esau. And our thesis is pretty much built on about 4 pillars, right? It's built on the physical markers, which we'll get into, the cultural trajectory, the historical displacement, and ultimately prophetic fulfillment. So we're going to make sure to use classical sources, archaeological evidence, and prophetic texts to establish this connection. Right. So we'll start at the beginning, the Genesis foundation. Big G's in the chat. The man, the prophecy, and the bloodline. Right. The birth of Esau, the physical marker. Right. History puts this at around 1700 BCE. Mind you, when we're going through these things, realize that the world is operating on a dating scale that is based on, you know, for the most part, carbon dating. So we got to keep those things in mind. But the Hebrew description, right? We see it in the book of Genesis, chapter 25 and verse number 25, right? Where it talks about, as a matter of fact, let me pull that up really quick. I'll get this in the Bible Hub. Make sure to share this screen too. Share my entire screen. That way we don't have to worry about that. All praises. Right. So we're going to get the book of Genesis, chapter 25. We're going to go down to verse number 25. Get to the point. Right. So it says the first one came out red. Matter of fact, what version is this? We're going to get this in the KJV. Genesis chapter 25 and verse number 25. And the first came out red all over like an hairy garment. And they called his name Esau. Right. So this is going into the physical description of what Esau looks like. He was born exhibiting two key physical characteristics that serve as primary markers for his descendants throughout history. Right. Number one, he was red all over. Right. The name Edom itself means red, Adam, right, or Adawam, and denotes a ruddy, fair complexion. Right. The physical trait becomes a significant, the signature identifier for the migrating lineage. Right. Number two, hairy, like a garment, all over, signifying heavy body hair and a shaggy appearance. Right. The name for the Edomite mountain region actually is Mountain Seir. Right. Which goes back to the same word, and it shares this root. So first and foremost, this prophecy establishes the national nature of the conflict, and it sets the stage for a dramatic reversal of status where the older brother, Esau, is destined to serve the younger brother, only to later break that yoke. Right. So this tension is kind of like the core driver of the national narrative that we're tracing. The physical marker, the red, ruddy complexion and pronounced body hair, is our first and most important identifier for later correlation, of course. So that name, that description, Edom, Adam, red, reddish, ruddy, right? It permanently stamps the lineage, because we don't see a description of skin tone or skin color when it comes to Jacob being born. This is something that we harp on a lot when coming to show that Esau is a so-called white man while we're teaching out on the streets. The physical trait, again, becomes the significant identifier for later civilizations and cultures. All right, let's keep going. Right, so now you have the prophetic blessing. We see this in the book of Genesis chapter 27, verse 39 to 40. So we'll go just a little bit. We'll go just a little bit ahead to, so like in Genesis chapter 27. Boom. And we'll read 39 to 40. Verse number 39. And Isaac, his father, while he was on his deathbed, answered and said unto him, Behold, thy dwelling shall be the fatness of the earth and of the dew of heaven from above. And by thy sword shalt thou live, and shalt serve thy brother. And it shall come to pass, when thou shalt have the dominion, that thou shalt break his yoke from off thy neck. Right. So these two promises define the national existence of Edom. Number one, acquiring strategic resource rich lands, which will be a fulfillment, of dwelling. His dwelling shall be the fatness of the earth. Right. When you go into that fatness, it's talking about the richness of the earth. And then maintaining that wealth throughout conquest or force, which would be him living by the sword. So that final clause promise while Isaac was on his deathbed, that he promises Esau or Edom will eventually break free and dominate the younger brother, which kind of sets the stage for the dynamic of their relationship that we see throughout history. And we're going to get into that even more. Right. So Isaac conferred a blessing upon Esau that defined his national destiny, setting the stage for perpetual conflict and global wealth. The mandate that you're going to live by the sword is a mandate for a militaristic, expansionist, and technologically superior culture defined by warfare and conquest. Right? We're going to expose that and show that. The fatness of the earth, which is the promise of dwelling in rich, resourceful lands. This is fulfilled not locally, but globally, right? So it's not just dealing with where they were at the time that he got the blessing, but it's throughout his lineage, and it's not isolated to just one region, right? And that's going to be accomplished and achieved through imperial conquest and economic mastery, right? The prophecy grants the elder brother the chance to break the younger's yoke and rise to a dominion. So the primary location for the Edomite nation, establishing their territorial sovereignty, is Mount Seir, right? This is the foundational kingdom and land that was given to Esau. We see this all throughout the scriptures. Right. Basra and Teman, which are key cities in the Edomite heartland, often cited by prophets such as Jeremiah and Jeremiah 49:13, and Obadiah chapter 1 and verse 9 as centers of the kingdom, confirming the geopolitical identity of these people. And then Dedan, a mercantile city representing an Edomite wealth derived from controlling trade routes, which is an early fulfillment of the fatness of the fatness blessing, the fatness of the land blessing. So we are going to actually dive into these, and we're going to show specifically how who we call today the Caucasians would fit this throughout the annals of time. Right? Let's continue. The lineage split. And it's very important to note that in the book of Genesis, chapter 28 and verse number 9, Mahalath, the daughter of Ishmael, right? Esau married the daughter of Ishmael, which is going to help identify that there is a particular line of Esau that is Southern Arabian, and it's genetic and cultural. It's a genetic and cultural component to the Edomite nation, right? And then this mingling created two distinct Edomite lines: the northern line, which was ruddy, lived and conquered by the sword and was focused on migrating north, right? And then there's a southern line, which is a more Arabized, desert-focused lineage or line remaining within the Levant region, right? The southern line became culturally intertwined with the Nabateans, which we're going to get into more. They were a major Arabic-speaking desert culture of people, and it confirms the Arabization of the Edomites remaining near Mount Seir. We can see this. We can see this talked about more so at length in Strabo's writing Geographica 14 or 16, section 4.21. Right. So these these lines, right, the northern line and the southern line of Esau, actually suffered two different immediate fates. But we'll see them clash and come back into unification later on. And also, when we're talking about intermingling or mixing, we got to remember that Esau also intermingled with Canaanites, with the lineage of Canaan, right? The Hamitic component in Genesis chapter 36, verse 2-3, Esau married a Hittite woman, right, which is the lineage of Canaan, making the Edomite nation racially diverse from its inception, right? And this means the focus is on prophetic markers over a single skin tone. So while we're out teaching, this is another thing that we try to make very clear to our people who seem to be focused on physical appearance. We understand that your lineage is not necessarily denoted by what you look like. It's not phenotypical. It's not according to your skin tone, right? That doesn't tell who you are. And this is something that Esau has mastered over the years, because what he looks to do is he looks to hide himself, right? We see this in various other prophecies, such as Job. We'll get into it later, but this is a very key point, because even though we're going to allow the information that's being brought out to kind of cover the physical attributes or the physical identifiers, it's not going to be the totality of what we're looking at today. So the lineage diversity, Edom absorbed Canaanite and Horite lineages, resulting in a darker Levantine complexion within the southern line. Again, Arabic speaking people is what they had, is who he had mixed and mingled with, and then also a Canaanite people he had mixed and mingled with. So the seed that would be known as Edomites were now mixed and mingled to look like a darker tone and complexion. But the presentation follows the strain that exhibits the strain that or follows the strain that exhibits the physical prophecy, right? Ready, hairy all over, and the cultural prophecy, right? So we combine the two. We don't just focus on the one. The distinction in fate. The darker skinned Edomite line was assimilated in the Levant, while the ruddy living by the sword line carried the prophecy of global dominion. So you have the southern line, which was mixing and mingling with the Canaanites, the Arabites, the Ishmaelites, Salakia, and then you have the northern line, which suffered a different fate. Right. So the southern fate was, the lineage was fully absorbed into regional populace, fulfilling the local destruction prophecies such as Jeremiah 49:10. But then the northern, the fate of the northern line mixed and mingled with different people groups such as the Scythians, the Sarmatian tribes, and those were the ones that survived the diaspora to become a political and military power and the rulers of the world that we see today, ultimately. Right. So now we're going to dive into the diaspora and the assimilation, right? Going into the geopolitical push and the migration to the north, right? The cradle. So now we're going to start to dive into some of these cultures, and we're going to start with the Natufian culture, right? The Natufian culture and the resource mastery. So again, talked about the dating. History dates this people group all the way back to about 12,500 BCE. And they thrived for about 3,000 years. So the Levant, the ancestral home of Esau, was the global center of agricultural innovation, right? Establishing a cultural identity and resource mastery. When we look at and deal with the Natufian culture, it's the foundational culture that helped pioneer settled sedentary life and agriculture within the Levant, right? The people of Esau's land were among the first to start to master the soil, which was an initial fulfillment of the dwelling in the fatness of the land. Right. They had a resource controlling lifestyle within the Levant. And it proves that the indigenous ability to master the soil and control resource wealth, which is one of the primary pillars that we're looking at when it comes to these prophetic markers, right? The cultural root of the fatness of the earth promise. And we see this in a book called a paper called The Natufian Culture and the Origin of the Neolithic Levant, right? You can read that. You can pull that up from Harvard University, right? They go in depth at this. The Natufian culture is our archaeological marker, right? It represents the earliest known sedentary culture within the Levant. Sedentary just means like a sitting culture, stationary, a culture that doesn't move around a lot or is not active, right? They mastered resource control such as wild grain harvesting and settlement before agriculture itself really began. So it's critical because it establishes the people who mastered the land to such an extent that they unlocked the fatness of the earth through settled resource control, right? The Bible says in Genesis chapter 27 that he will dwell in the fatness of the land, right? So it's not just about being there for a little bit, but it's also talking about living there, right? This is a culture that was living over the course of 3,000 years within this region, right? If you look at the map, you can see that there is an expansion, however, of the Natufian culture over the course of that 3,000 years. So they started out, right, with an early Natufian homeland, and then they expanded out. They expanded out further north, right? There's a reason for that. So we'll get into that too. The early diaspora, right, starting with propelled by Assyrian pressure during the 9th century BCE, right? So the 900, they around the year 900 BCE all the way up until the 7th century BCE. Political subjugation and tribute. The Edomite king. Again, we're looking at the different cultures, such as the Natufian culture, and they would have been coming to an end around the time that this Assyrian pressure began. Political subjugation and tribute. The Edomite kingdom was subjugated, was a subjugated tributary state to the Assyrian Empire, providing the initial push factor that was needed for a migration, right? As far as them being a sedentary people, they wouldn't have a need to migrate or move out of their land when they are dwelling within the fatness of the earth and they have the resources that they need, the agricultural presence and availability that they need when it comes to the resources. So there would have had to be a push factor that caused them or propelled them into a migration, right? The tribute payments, 8th century BCE, Edomite king Quasmalaku paid heavy tribute to Tiglath Pileser III. Right, we see this written in the book of Anet, page 252. Right, I have it over here over to the side, and I'll just read the excerpt real quick. It says it's from a building inscription on clay preserved in various copies published by Rawlinson in volume 2, place 61, translation. I installed Itabili as a warden of marches on the border of Masur. In all the countries which I received the tribute of Kushtashpi, of Commagene, Uric of Quay, Sibitabel of Byblos, Anil of Hamath, Panamu of Samal, Tarhulara of Gumgum, Salumal of Milatine, Osirmi of Tabal, Ushiti of Tuna, Urbala of Tuhana, Tuhame of Ishtunda, right? Montenbel of Arvad, Sanipu of Bit Aman, Salamanu of Moab, Matinti of Ashkelon, Jehoahaz of Judah, Koshmalaku of Edom. Right. So that again, the Edomite king, amongst all of these other kings that were under the Assyrian pressure, were caused and forced to pay tribute, right, to King Tiglath. So this was a constant financial drain that provided a strong incentive for peripheral tribes and skilled warriors to start to migrate to the north. And as they migrated, they began to seek mercenary service with the powerful tribes of the steppe, right? The Scythians, right, and the Cimmerian period of assimilation began centuries before the collapse of Petra, right? So the Neo-Assyrian Empire heavily taxed and campaigned against Edom. This economic and military vice created an early refuge diaspora of tribes and mercenaries who traveled north to join the expanding Scythian confederacies, right? And we're harping on the Scythians because we're going to see who those people are as well as we get further and further into this presentation. But again, we have the Edomite peoples, which had established the Natufian culture, now being forced to migrate to the north, right? The final collapse. The Nabatean conquest. Remember, we mentioned the Nabateans. We mentioned the Nabateans earlier when we spoke about the southern line, right? Esau mixing and mingling with Ishmael and providing or creating a Arabic-speaking, darker-skinned people group, which later became known as the Nabateans, right? So the final irreversible displacement of the Edomite sovereignty entity was completed by the Nabateans, right? The Nabateans conquered. The Nabateans conquered and permanently occupied the Edomite capital, Petra. We could read about this in Petra and the Lost Kingdom of the Nabateans by Jane Taylor. And they turned it into the center of their trading empire. All right, we can also reference this from Diodorus Siculus in Library of the History 19.94. Right, so these Edomites were forced out of the kingdom. They were forced out of their land. They were forced out of their sovereignty, right? Because they were conquered by the Nabateans. And then they were also being forced, then they were also being forced by by the Nabateans who came through in conquest and took over the capital of Petra, right? And Petra in itself is, Petra in itself is for the most part an amazement, right? When you look at the capital city and you look at how the city is so it's so ingrained within the rock, within the mountains, within the landscape, right? They literally built the kingdom they built their kingdom and the architecture within the landscape, right? But the Nabateans coming and conquering them and permanently uprooting the Edomites out of their capital city kind of helped bring a fulfillment to the book of Jeremiah chapter 49, which says that but I made Esau bare, I have uncovered his secret places, and he shall not be able to hide himself. His seed is spoiled, his brethren, his neighbors, and he is not, right? So again, we deal with the Edomites looking to hide themselves. We deal with them looking to establish themselves, but the Most High God has said and prophesied that he would be able to make them bare and expose their secret places. So this in itself helped give the final push for a total nationalist exodus to the north, right? So we had some that were forced out due to the Assyrian pressure, and then the rest by conquest of the Nabateans, right? So they as a people, as a nation, began their exodus to the north, right? To the steppes or the Caucasus. It's kind of like a final blow. You know how you know how you know that a fight is over with and you finna win the fight, and then you land that one good right hand that that really just puts them down, right? This is what the Nabatean conquest was, right? They completely stripped them of their ancestral territory, and they fulfilled that prophecy to T. So Edom, Esau was no longer a national sovereign power, right? They no longer had that they no longer had that sovereignty. They were no longer a geopolitical entity, right? Even though they had spent time building their kingdom and establishing that sedentary lifestyle. Well, let's keep going. So now that they're in this period of migration, now that they're in this period of being expelled out of their land and they're being forced into the north, this brings them to the low point that we see in the book of Job. And this is Job chapter 30 and verse number, I'll start at verse number 1, read 1 through 8. But now they that are younger than I have me in derision, whose fathers I have disdained to have set with the dogs of my flock. Yea, whereto might the strength of their hands profit me, in whom old age perished, was perished. For want and famine they were solitary, fleeing into the wilderness in former time, desolate and waste, who cut up mallows by the bushes and juniper roots for their meat. So on this Exodus, they are scavenging, they're scavenging, right? Fleeing into the wilderness, cutting up bushes and juniper root, and this is their food, right? They're eating of the grassland, they're eating of the bushes as they travel north, showing the scarcity of the meat that they were allowed and the resources that they would have. Verse number 5, they were driven forth from among men, right? Going back into the Assyrian pressure, going back into the Nabateans. They cried after them as after a thief, to dwell in the cliffs of the valleys, in caves of the earth, and in the rocks. Among the bushes they brayed, under the nettles they were gathered together. They were children of fools, yea, children of base men. They were viler than the earth. So again, we see that these people that Job is speaking about were forced out of their home. They were forced to scavenge off of the ground and out of the land in its scarcity. And then they were caused to, because they were driven out by men and chased out, such as the Nabateans did, they were forced to dwell in the cliffs, in the caves, and in the rocks. Very key. Very, very key, right? So the immediate consequence, obviously, of the immediate consequence of the expulsion, right, was a debased refuge state, right? They were forced to dwell in the cliffs, providing a motivation for the mass migration. Again, that now they got to continue to go north, because as of right now, as they immediately get expelled and are being chased out by the Nabateans, their homeland is taken over. You know, they're scavenging off to the ground as they go. They got to continue to move. They got to continue to go. Any hunter-gatherer society will attest to it through their history that you go where the animals go. You go where the food goes. You have to continue to migrate and move as you hunt and look for food. So this period of destitution fulfills a crucial gap, right? The Edomites were reduced to a state of primitive wilderness dwellers, suffering scorn and hunger. And this temporary low point contrasts starkly with their eventual global rule, providing the necessary motivation for their desperate and massive movement north in search of a new, powerful national identity. And this is where we can track the path of their migration, right? Through the Caucasian corridors, as we're going to call it today. It's really the Levantine corridors. It's really the Levantine corridors. But This is literally the only viable route that we can trace them through, right? And we're gonna explain why here. The the Levant is a geographical choke point, right? Any large scale population that is exiled north is naturally funneled towards Anatolia and the Caucasus. It's very clear, very simple, right? Anatolia is like the transitional zone between the quote unquote Near East and Eurasia. The Caucasus Mountains are the primary geographical marker for the emerging Caucasian identity and the route into the steppe. Right, and then the steppe is the vast plains of Eurasia, home to the dominant militaristic tribes that would absorb the Edomite strain. How do we know that this is the only route to go? When we look at the history, we see the Hyksos. The Hyksos were a non-Egyptian Semitic people or Semitic related people who were militarily driven out of Egypt, right? The template for their movement was their exodus north. Their exodus to the north established a historically validated demographic highway from the Levant toward Anatolia and the Caucasus, right? We read that in Josephus's Contra Appionum, section 1.14, right? So the Hyksos in themselves were driven out of their homeland, right? In or around the same area. And we'll take a look at that in a second. But the only viable way for them to go was through the Levantine corridors, right? They traveled north, and we're going to take a look at that. And this is the same pattern that the dispersed Edomites went. They were absorbed by groups on their migratory path, right? Such as the Chalybes, right, which were master iron workers, the Caucasian Iberians, which had that mountain militarianism, and the Nok peoples, right, which were a people who had mastered the tower architecture, right? And ultimately fulfilling Obadiah 1 and 3. Let's take a look at that real quick. Let's take a look at the book of Obadiah real quick. Obadiah 1, verse number 3. The pride of thine heart had deceived thee, thou that dwellest in the clefts of the rock, whose habitation is high, that saith in his heart, who shall bring me down to the ground? Right. So again, these people, such as the Nok people, and even Edomites, when we look at the culture and the habitation that they had in Petra, right? They dwelt in the high places of the rock. They dwelt there, and they thought, oh, listen, who's going to bring us down? We're going to be able to see all around. We are uninvadable, is what they thought. And they didn't think anything bad or negative would happen to them, right? But the thesis that we're presenting, right, even though, the further in that we get, you're going to see that this is beyond the thesis, right? But it identifies these groups located between the Levant and the steppe as assimilation points for the Edomites during the Iron Age. These groups display cultural characteristics such as metallurgy, extreme mountain defense, right? And these things fit the Edomite profile, the prophetic template, perfectly, honestly, as the migration moved through the Caucasus gateway, or the Caucasian corridors, right? So now we'll take a look at this. On the left, we have the path of the Hyksos as they migrated out of Egypt, due to the military powers that be. So like it, due to the military powers that be, right? So when we look at this, the dark green, and I hate that it's cut off, but the dark green solid line is the first phase of their exodus or their expulsion. The darker green dotted line is phase number 2. So they continue to go north. And then the lightly dotted line is phase number 3. And this is now diving into the land that we saw the Natufian culture occupying, right? But again, as they traveled north up and through the land of Canaan, they come into the Levantine corridor, right? Which you can see at the bottom right, black and white image, right? You have the in the Hyksos expulsion, you have the base of the Mediterranean Sea right before it curves up into the land of Canaan. Hold on, so like yeah, right, right before it curves up into the land of Canaan. And then on the bottom right, you see that exact same land. And as you proceed north, you run into the Levantine corridor, right? This is the route in which the Edomites had to take after being expelled, the same way that the Hyksos, after being expelled, had to take that route, right? So the evidence is there, and the people who actually did it first and took that route are the ones who set the stage for us to be able to utilize that route as a valid way to trace the Edomites. Now, the architectural proof that we can see along the way is the Nok peoples. You know, I referenced Obadiah 1 and 3 very briefly. But the Nok peoples with the Vanok Tower architecture, and which are the stone fortresses on cliffs, directly reflect the core Edomite prophecy of dwelling in the clefts of the rock. Right? Cultural continuation, which is, you know, this unique architectural tradition, represents the same core characteristic and extreme pride in the security of their high rock-bound dwelling that defined Petra, right? And that Edomite cultural spirit survived within the indigenous Caucasus tribes. Right, we can see that in archaeological and the architectural survey of Chechnya and Ingushetia. Right, the the Nok people provide the most definitive cultural continuation, right? So we can link these people to who the Edomites were as they continue to travel north and establish themselves in different societies. Now, we mentioned the Scythians earlier and how the northern line of the Edomites, the ones that maintain that ruddy, live by the sword mentality, prophetic marker, how they assimilated into and became synonymous with the Scythians, right? So I'll do my best to read this, but the Scythians were the ruddy sword strain that merged with dominant Japhetic tribes, and they became they became like a vehicle, right? The primary vehicle for the Edomite lineage, meaning that the Edomites were within the Scythians and the Cimmerians. But as the Scythians moved and traveled, the Edomites were within them and then began to grow and rise to power from within them. Very similar to how we see and the curses in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 28, that a stranger that is within thee shall get very high and we gonna be brought low. Right? This is how the Edomites operated, right? Within every culture that they assimilated into. They would weasel their way in, rise to power, take over, right? So the physical confirmation, Greek writers noted that their ruddy, fair complexions provided the external confirmation of the red or, Edomite or Adam physical strain, right? We can read about that in Hippocrates' writing on airs, waters, and places, section number 24. And I have that just below. In regards to the Scythians, the excerpt continues and it says, dries up from their joints and their bodies become more braced, more nourished, better articulated. Their bodies grow relaxed and squat. Firstly, because unlike the Egyptians, they do not use swaddling clothes, of which they have not the habit, for the sake of their riding, right? Because they were a people that continue to ride and ride on horses, and that they may sit on a horse well. Secondly, through their sedentary lives, right? Again, going back to the Natufian people, and where they originated from. This is the confirmation that these two people are linked. For the boys, until they can ride, sit the greater part of the time in the wagon, and because of the migrations and wanderings, which again, the Natufian people, the Edomites, were expelled and had to migrate, rarely walked on foot, while the girls are wonderfully flabby and torpid in physique. Sidebar, we still see this characteristic in these women. But the Scythians are a ruddy race of people, are a ruddy race because of the cold, not through any fierceness in the sun's heat. It is the cold that burns their white skin and turns it ruddy. What people group do we know that have pale or white skin, and in the cold it becomes red? It's this is 1 + 1, right? 1 + 1. But let's take a look at how the Encyclopedia Britannica defines a Scythian, right? And I'll try to be brief in going through this. But a Scythian is a member of a nomadic people originally of Iranian stock, known from as early as the 9th century BCE, who migrated westward from Central Asia to southern Russia and Ukraine. And in the 8th century and 7th centuries BCE, the Scythians founded a rich, powerful empire centered on what is now Crimea. The empire survived for several centuries before succumbing to the Sarmatians during the period from the 4th century BCE to the 2nd century, right? Until the 20th century, most of what was known of the history of the Scythians came from the account of them by the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, who visited their territory. In modern times, that record had been expanded chiefly by Russians and other anthropologists excavating kurgans in such places as Tiva and Kazakhstan. Right, so these people, these Scythians, were documented and written about by the Greek historian Herodotus, and continue to be written about through other anthropologists and Russians. The Scythians were feared and admired for their prowess in war. Again, there's that living by the sword, and in particular for their horsemanship. They were among the earliest people to master the art of riding, and their mobility astonished their neighbors. The migration of the Scythians from Asia eventually brought them into the territory of the Cimmerians, who had traditionally controlled the Caucasus and the plains north of the Black Sea. In a war that lasted 30 years, the Scythians destroyed the Cimmerians and set themselves up as rulers of the empire, stretching from West Persia through Syria and Judea to the borders of Egypt. The Medes, who ruled Persia, attacked them and drove them out of Anatolia, leaving them finally in control of the lands that which stretched from the Persian borders north through the Kuban and into southern Russia. Right? Here's again, here's the point, because we're harping on a couple things here, right? The prophetic marker, which is the ruddiness, right? The physical attributes or the physical markers, but we're also diving into the blessing that they were giving and the living by the sword, which we saw the northern line continue in, right? So the Scythians and the Cimmerians, but the Scythians overcame the Cimmerians, and the Scythians were remarkable not only for their fighting ability, but also for their complex culture they produced. They developed a class of wealthy aristocrats who left elaborate graves, right? I think that is yeah, that's what I wanted to cover as far as the Scythians go. So let's see, the tracing the prophetic markers, because we have dealt with the physical markers. Right now it's time to dive into tracing the prophetic markers. So the prophetic dwellings, right? The Dario Pass choke point. Again, going back to Obadiah chapter 1 and verse 3. The strategic importance of the pass, the Dario Pass, right? Or the Iberian Gates, as it's also called. And it's the single most vital north-south military and trade checkpoint in the Central Caucasus. Control of this pass was essential to controlling the assimilation zone. Right? It was necessary. It was a necessary corridor for the entire Edomite diaspora to reach the Scythian and Sarmatian steppe. Right? Control over the pass provided immense wealth via tolls and tribute and essential fulfillment of the fatness of the earth via geographical control. So again, and being able to control this checkpoint that we see as the Dario Pass would give them access to be able to collect toll, tribute, and be able to take over as a trading post, which we see that the Scythian and Sarmatian people did in their excavating of this of their exodus to the steppes. All right, y'all with me so far? Is it making sense? Are the dots starting to connect? Right. Again, the cultural persistence of fortified citadels and castles that we see by the Scythians, the Cimmerians, the different northern Edomite peoples across Europe and the Caucasus, especially during the medieval period. It symbolizes the global political arrogance of these people and their claim, whether it's a true claim or whether it's a false claim, to dominance. But now we're going to dive into some more. The Celtic and Gaulish people. They had an early Western dominion, right, of about 600 BC. at about 600 BCE. The first wave west, right? The Celts positioned as a key link between the Scythians, the Scythian dispersal, and the Roman expansion, right? So demonstrated an early fulfillment of the Edomite markers, right? So we have classical accounts noted that the Celts were a fair and ruddy complexion people, and they have fierce militarism, right? This is not unknown even to people who are not of a biblical background. This is this is historically common knowledge. And their tribes seized the fatness of the earth across vast European lands such as Gaul, Britain, Central Europe, centuries before the Romans did, right? So this is a people who had already possessed those prophetic markers as well as the physical markers before we even get to Rome. And immediately after, immediately after the Scythian dispersal, right? Which we've already identified are missing link of the Edomite people and their history. Now we're diving into the Chalybes. The Chalybes were a people that were mastering iron. They were very famous, and they provide a literal link to the sword mandate near the migration corridor. So this is not only a people that fit the marker of the prophecy or the physical markers that we're looking for, but they also have done these things and established themselves near the migration corridor, in which we've already illustrated was very key and essential and the exodus of the Edomites, right? This is a path that we clearly painted, that we know that they would have to take. It's like being able to have an ancient map GPS, and we're looking to the ultimate destination of the Edomites and where they ended up, and then this GPS tells us how they got there. When we look at how the Hyksos did it, this is our GPS, right? So the Chalybes already established themselves and took over, mastering this ironwork and fulfilling these prophetic and physical markers near the migration corridor, in which the Caucasians would have had to pass through. Right. Chalybes in itself is a Greek word for hardened steel, right? Because they were metal workers. They were known for their metallurgy. That word. The prophetic utility. They were master armorers who enhanced the weapons of the migrating northern tribes, ensuring the superiority of the sword for centuries. Right. Again, these people, the Celts, helped establish that pre-Roman dispersal of the Caucasian stocks into Western Europe, and as a large, ruddy complexioned and aggressive people, right? They had such a rapid expansion, and it's clear that they had the fulfillment of the fatness of the earth blessing, in which we could see within European and Caucasian people today, as well as we saw with Esau. Right. Moving on, because now we're going into the final dominion, right? The ascent to the world power, which is probably the most famous period in Edomite history, and probably one that is most well known, and probably one that is most talked about, right? And it starts in the book of Daniel. In the book of Daniel, chapter 2 goes into the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, King Nebuchadnezzar, right, where he had a dream of a certain statue. The statue had a head of gold, Had a head of gold, had breasts of silver, had thighs of brass, legs of iron, toes of iron mingled and mixed with clay, right? Very, very significant. The succession, right? The prophetic timeline confirms a political succession with the Edomite aligned powers occupying the final stages of the Gentile world system, right? What do I mean by that? Well, the Hellenistic period, or the Hellenic Empire, is the first successor of the Assyrian Persian powers, representing the re-emergence of the militaristic strain. The Roman Empire is the ultimate material of strength and breaking power, representing the ultimate fulfillment of the sword prophecy. Right? The Macedonian Empire, right, which is the brass. The Edomite strain reemerged through the militaristic Macedonian ruling class. What do I mean by that? Well, when we see certain peoples go off, that they began to veer off, they now and fade away, they now reemerged as a more powerful ruling class. The Macedonians themselves are not all Edomic or all Edomite. However, the Edomite strain had gotten into, mingled with, and risen to power within the Macedonian Empire, right? And this is very clear. The clearest example is Alexander the Great. His conquest secured the fatness of the earth and fully enacted the, live by the sword, or by the sword you shall live, blessing on a global scale. We can see that he is historically one of the most successful military powers that this world has ever seen. So there's no denying that. And we also know that he is a Macedonian, right? We also know that we can tie him directly to the Edomites, but his successors, Seleucids, or the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, maintained the rivalry with the house of Jacob. And then the Roman Empire, which, is not too far from the Macedonian Empire, or the Greek Empire. Rome is the ultimate material and symbolic realization of the sword, right? The iron portions. Rome's identity was defined by its total military supremacy and capacity for conquest, the highest form of the sword prophecy. This is another proof that we have in regards to the Romans being Edomites. When we look at the ancient Jewish traditions, it explicitly identifies Rome with Edom, right? When we look into the Talmudic literature, the Babylonian Talmud, specifically, Avodah Zarah 10a, it provides the powerful confirmation that we need, right? And I'll read it. It says, one of the Gentile festivals listed in the Mishnah is the day of the festival Genusia of their kings. The Gemara asks, what is meant by the day of Genusia of their kings? Rav Yehuda says, this is referring to the day on which the Gentiles appoint and crown their king. The Gemara asks, but isn't it taught in Bereda? Two Gentile festivals are the day of Genisa and the day on which the Gentiles appoint their king. This indicates that these are two separate occasions. The Gemara answers that it is not difficult. The day of Genisia is referring to the coronation of the king himself, whereas that the day on which the Gentiles appoint and crown their king is referring to the coronation of his son, when a son is crowned during his father's lifetime. The Gemara asks, and do the Romans actually appoint as king the son as king the son of a king? But didn't Rav Yosef teach this verse relating a prophecy about Edom associated with the Roman Empire? Behold, I will make you small among the nations, Obadiah 1 and 2, is a reference to the fact that the Romans do not place on the throne as king the son of a king. The continuation of the verse, you are greatly despised, is a reference to the fact that the Romans have neither their own script nor their own language, but use those of other nations. The Gemara therefore rejects the explanation of the Bereta that distinguishes between coronation of a king and the coronation of a king's son. Rather, what is the day of Gynesea? It is the king's birthday. Right? So we have here in the Babylonian Talmud, they are directly, and I do mean directly, associating the Edomites and the Romans as the same people. They're actually identifying the Romans as being a fulfillment of Edomite prophecies. Right? This is not this is not algebra, people. Not algebra at all. Right? But there are some who still don't believe, even though we've traced them all the way from about 12,000 BCE all the way up until the Roman Empire. But let's keep going. All right? Let's keep going. Let's dive even further, right? Because we now have the Edomites who will show and prove that they, being within the empire, are Edomites. And we'll start with King Herod, right? Herod the Idumean, or Edomite. The last verifiable Edomite ruling house provided the clearest link between the ancient rivalry and the New Testament era. The Idumean lineage, Herod the Great's family, was documented. It's on paper. You could check the files. We got the receipts. They were documented as Idumean, or tracing back to Esau, right? We read this in Josephus's Antiquity of the Jews, 14.15.2, right? And it also goes into prophecy, talking about the dragon. But we'll also get into that later. King Herod sought to murder the newborn Christ as a child, acting as a historical Edomite executor of the dragon's will, right? Which we see in Matthew chapter 2 and verses 16 through 18. So let's take a look at that real quick. Matthew chapter 2 and verse number 16. Then Herod, when he saw that he was mocked of the wise men, was exceeding wroth, and he sent forth and slew all of the children that were in Bethlehem and in all the coasts thereof, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had diligently inquired of the wise men. Then was fulfilled that which was spoken by Jeremy the prophet, talking about Jeremiah, saying, in Ramah was there a voice heard, lamentation and weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and would not be comforted because they are not. Right, so there's great lamentation and mourning going on because this man, King Herod the Idumean, the Edomite, is going around murdering children, infants, toddlers, 2 years old and under. Sounds very familiar? I think so. All right. And then also Joel chapter 3. It's like Joel chapter 3 and verse number 6. The children of Judah were sold to the Grecians, right? The prophecy of Judah's servitude began under the Edomite aligned Macedonian Greeks, right? The Hellenistic era, which we just read about with Alexander the Great or Alexander the Greek, right? So we have an Edomite and an Edomite ruling class, the Macedonians, the Greeks, and their continued destruction, which we could read about in the book of Maccabees, of the Israelites and their heritage, their culture, the oppression of the Edomites on the so-called Blacks, Hispanics, and Native Americans, or the Israelites, was being fulfilled at this time. And it continues to draw, again, going back to Genesis chapter 25 and 25, that two nations being in the womb and them being two different people, that enmity, that one shall serve the other. And then, it's there. It's there. Right, the selling of the children of Judah to the Grecians commenced the latter-day servitude of the house of Jacob under Edom's aligned powers. And this, my friends, foreshadowed the total economic and physical dominance of the younger brother by the Edomite aligned empire. I mean, really, at this point, we could stop. At this point, we could stop. I'm gonna keep going though. All right. Let's continue on. The prophetic profile, the nation from the north. Because again, we have to remember, after these people have been kicked out of the Levant, they migrated north. They came into power from being smaller Edomite groups, societies that were clashing and merging against one another, to ultimately submitting and become mercenaries to the Grecian and or Roman powers that had created an empire, and then they were attacking, warring against this Roman Empire, while other tribes, Edomite tribes, were serving them and fighting against one another. So this is a continued internal battle amongst Esau. But a lot of the problem is Esau had gotten to a point where he hid himself so well and had become so dispersed amongst those northern lands, while also being fueled by that continued desire to dominate, that he was warring against himself while warring against the rest of the world. Right? So now they are in the northern region. They had, Salakia. They had occupied the Dorian Pass. They had taken over the steppes. They had made a home and secured a home within the Caucasus Mountains in the north, where it's cold. Right? Now, let's take a look at some prophecy. Book of Jeremiah, chapter 50, and verse number 41 through 42. Because this usage of prophecy, which we do believe and understand and know that some prophecy has dual fulfillment, right? So we're not going to sit here and act like it doesn't. We know that there's an immediate application of some prophecy, and there's also a latter application, sometimes once, sometimes twice, sometimes a multiplicity if we talk about the curses of Deuteronomy chapter 28. So since Rome is, in this instance, a version or a form of Mystery Babylon, the code describing Babylon's destroyers in Jeremiah chapter 50 is applied to Rome's destroyers, literally which were the Goths and the Vandals, who perfectly fit the cruel and northern profile, right? So let's take a look at let's start at Habakkuk chapter 1. Let's start at the Habakkuk chapter 1. Whoa. Habakkuk chapter 1. Habakkuk chapter 1 and verse number 8. Start at verse number 7. They are dreaded. Matter of fact, I'll start at verse number 6. For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that ruthless and impetuous nation, which marches through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. Again, we know that this is something that Edomite peoples have done, that they continue to do even to this day. They are dreaded and feared. From themselves, they derive justice and sovereignty, right? So, again, this is something that they still continue to do to this day, but even more so while they were in their primitive states trying to take over and establish cultures, territories, societies, so on and so forth. Their horses are swifter than leopards, fiercer than wolves of the night. Their horsemen charge ahead, and their cavalry comes from afar. They fly like a vulture swooping down to devour. Right. When we go back to what we were reading in regards to the Scythians, right? This is an identifier of how they moved. When we read about, which we will, about the Goths, the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths, right? And the Vandals, these markers that we're reading about in the book of Habakkuk and Jeremiah, which we'll get there in a second, are, it's almost like pinning a tail on a donkey, right? There's no other place that it fits. All them come bent on violence. Their hordes advance like the east wind. They gather prisoners like the sand. They scoff at kings and make rulers an object of scorn. They laugh at every fortress and build up siege ramps to seize it. Right? This is something that, again, we can see throughout the history of the Edomite clans, peoples, and how and why they attack people. They pillage, they murder, they look to take over cities, they plunder all types of different villages and indigenous peoples, as well as coming up against rulers of high societies and empires, such as the Romans, right? The which we'll get into very briefly, the Goths, whether the Visigoths or the Ostrogoths, continue to attack Rome, right? The Vandals attacked Rome, and then they attacked the Goths, right? The Alans. Like this is it's like having a driver's license with somebody's picture, name, all their information on it, their height, their weight, right? These prophecies identify the person that we're looking for. Right, getting back to Jeremiah chapter 50, I have it right here at the bottom of the screen. It says, behold, a people shall come from the north, and a great nation, and many kings shall be raised up from the coasts of the earth. Right, because again, the allegiance that they had was not just to one person, one individual, but because there were so many subsections of Edomite clans and peoples, they had different rulers or different rulers or leaders or kings of these different clans, right? So these clans had kings, many kings that were raised up from the coast of the earth. They shall hold the bow and the lance. They are cruel and will not show mercy, such as Herod, right? Didn't give a damn whether the child was 1, whether the child was 2, whether the child was 3 months old, right? Their voice shall roar like the sea, and they shall ride upon horses. Again, another identifier, because we've seen that with the Scythians, Cimmerians. We'll see that continue with the Goths, with the Vandals, with the Alans, with the Vikings. Everyone put in array like a man to battle against the daughter of Babylon, right? So this is another prophecy that goes to the Romans, right? Being the daughter of Babylon, because again, their ways were treacherously abominable, similar to the way that Babylon's were. They had a rulership and a captivity over many peoples and nations, very similar to how Babylon did, right? So prophetically speaking, this fits for what happened to Rome. And again, these people that were described here in Jeremiah chapter 50 are the same people that actually destroyed Rome. Speaking of destroying Rome, the Sarmatians, right? The bridge to Rome. The Sarmatians were the immediate successors to the Scythians, right? And the primary source of military cavalry to Rome. They served as crucial Roman cavalry allies, directly injecting the Edomite Sarmatian military strain in the Roman system, right? So it's like having a Edomite SD card, and then the Romans are the phone, and then you take that SD card with the Edomite strain, the physical strain, the prophetic markers of, occupying and dwelling, living by the sword, and then you plug it into that phone. And now that phone is everything that the SIM card was. They maintain the physical traits required for the lineage, bridging the gap from the steppe tribes to the Roman military, right? Just a quick side note, or a quick notation about the Sarmatians. And you can read about this in the book called The Sarmatians, 300 Years of Epic Conflict and Alliance. The great migrations of the 4th and 5th centuries brought even greater upheaval. Pressed by the advancing Goths and later the Huns, the Sarmatians lost their independent positions. Many were absorbed into Gothic kingdoms, while others joined the armies of the Huns. The Alans, however, retained a distinct identity. Some groups moved westward, taking part in the invasion of Gaul, Spain, and even North Africa, where they established kingdoms alongside the Vandals, another group of people that we're going to get into. By the early Middle Ages, the Sarmatians as a distinct people had largely disappeared, yet echoes of their presence survived. In Gaul, the region of Alencon preserves the memory of the Alans. In the Caucasus, the Ossetians trace their lineage to the Alans, preserving a distant connection to the Sarmatians of antiquity, right? So again, these people, even the Ossetians, right, which live within the Caucasus Mountains now, trace their lineage back to the Alans, which trace their lineage and connection back to the Sarmatians, which trace their lineage back to the Scythians, which trace their lineage back to the Edomite people that were kicked out by the Nabateans, right? Which trace their lineage back to the Natufians, which trace their lineage back to Edom. Like it's a straight line, man. It's a straight line. It's like chopping veggies, man. Very precise and concise, right? Now dealing with the Alans, right, which were a Sarmatian branch of people. They acted as a military vanguard of the final invasions, conquering key resource-rich lands. They marched west with the Vandals, right, and Suebi into Gaul and Spain around 406 CE. And they secured Iberia and North Africa, which was the center for the Roman grain supply, ensuring the conquest was multinational and fulfilling the fatness of the earth mandate. So again, we coming back to those 4 pillars that help us identify who Edom or Esau is today. And now we've crossed the point where we're diving now. We're at about the 5th century BC. We're at about the 5th century BC. So going from about on paper 12,000 BCE to now 500 CE or AD, as some of you know it, right? So the warrior culture dealing with the Sarmatians, right? They were successors to the Scythians, specializing in heavy armored cavalry. Roman integration, right? They settled throughout the Roman Empire as foederati, which were military allies, integrating the steppe military strain into the core imperial defense structure, right? So the Sarmatians carried the Scythian military legacy forward, perfecting the sword culture or living by the sword culture. Their deep integration into the Roman military as settlers and allies provided a major pathway for the Edomite ruddy, northern line genetic and cultural lineage to move forward from the steppe and Caucasus Mountains into Western Europe, right? So the Roman Empire and them hiring these different military groups and clans to help fight for them was the excuse needed by these peoples to now come back after migrating north, to now come back down and help to occupy and or take over and defend Western Europe. Now, dealing with the iron and clay, because we talked about Daniel chapter 2 and going into what and who the statue represents in its different periods with the different materials, right? And we have the Goth kingdom, the Goths, founding kingdoms, right? The Goths, the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths, right? They're two separate types of Goth kingdoms. They were the first to demonstrate the successful permanent political power transfer of power, right? The Goths established successor kingdoms in Spain, what the Visigoths did, and in Italy, the Ostrogoths did, but they laid the political foundation for what we see in modern Europe, right? Being able to have kingdoms that are ruled by successors or lineal succession. They ensured the assimilated Sarmatian Germanic military strain was genetically and politically embedded in the core of the European continent, right? This is something that they spread throughout as they went forth to establish their kingdoms in Spain and Italy and so on and so forth. So they directly replaced the Roman administration in Spain and Italy and Gaul, which helped to accelerate the political and genetic assimilation of the Germanic ruddy ruling strain into the core of Western Europe. So the Goths were the most powerful and immediate inheritors of the Western Roman Empire. Their establishment of kingdoms solidified the new military ruling class in the heart of Europe. Then we have the Vandals, right, which were a maritime people, and they had that maritime dominion at and about around the same time. The Vandals solidified the fatness of the earth mandate by capturing the most vital economic resource of Western Empire. They conquered the Roman North Africa with Carthage, right? We can see that historically documented in 439 CE, and that helped them seize control of the Mediterranean grain supply, right? Economic warfare. They demonstrate the Edomite successors' ability to cripple the original empire by controlling its economic resources. Again, we see that the Edomites, the strain of the Edomites, has the ability to continue to assimilate into a people group, rise to power within that people group, and then take over and have dominance over that people group. Right? This is what the Vandals did, and how they controlled the grain supply, which helped them cripple the economy in Rome. Right? Now, dealing with the separation of the Goths, because I mentioned it very briefly, but they were split into two key theaters. The Visigoths, which were the West Goths, who had seized Iberia or Spain, establishing the economic and naval foundation for the future Spanish Empire, right? Which is the first global colonial power, right? So the Visigoths help establish the economic and naval foundation for the Spaniards, which we'll see brought up later on when it's dealing with a different type of captivity in a different time period. Then you have the Ostrogoths, which were the Eastern Goths. And they seized Italy and Rome, directly inheriting the political and symbolic center of the Iron Kingdom. Right. So when we look at this map, we can see in the darker pink or salmon color the Visigoth kingdom, and then in the orange we can see the Ostrogoth kingdom. How they were neighboring, but they operated separately, and then began to unify later on. Right. So now moving further. So now we're jumping from about 500 BC, or from about 500 CE to about 850 CE. Right. And this is where we come into the people, the Franks. The Franks. They were the most enduring and politically significant Germanic successor state, creating the institutional base for modern Europe. Right? They had their political stability. Their kingdoms formed the basis for modern France and Germany and laid the groundwork for the Holy Roman Empire. So when we look at the Roman Catholic Church, when we look at, the Vatican, when we look at the Pope, the Franks are responsible. They're the reason for that. They helped lay that groundwork, right? They helped lay that groundwork. The Merovingian and Carolingian dynasties consolidated military and political power across the iron clay framework, right? And we're gonna go into that a little bit more when I say and reference the iron clay. I want to be very detailed as to why I'm calling it that. Because there are some people who directly associate the iron clay mixture with America and America only. However, that's not so. Some people only utilize it to describe the EU. That's not so. That's a part of it, but that's not it in its totality, right? But moving forward, the Saxon lineage, right? The Anglo-Germanic foundation. The Saxons, or the Anglo-Saxons, I'll call them for now. The Anglo-Saxons established the ultimate northern fortress of the successor states, providing the genetic foundation for the British Empire, right? The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, in their conquest and settlement of Roman Britain, ensured the ruddy Germanic. I don't like calling it Germanic, but it's how they're identified, right? Because these people began to be Germanic in their identity. this ruddy Germanic strain became the primary political and genetic foundation for the British Isles, right? This is how and one of the ways in which they were basing their political foundation for the British Isles, right? Just as a little side note, the Anglo-Saxon was, I'll get to that in a second. Clovis the First actually united Gaul, right? Charlemagne's crowning at about 800 CE established the institutional link between the Germanic tribes and the imperial legacy of Rome, or the eagle. So the Franks, they're crucial because they solidified and secured the political framework, while Charlemagne created the Holy Roman Empire and solidified the fusion of the Germanic militarism and the Roman imperial tradition, providing the institutional base for centuries of European power. The Roman Empire is the Holy Roman Empire, I shall say, is the central source of a lot of the power in this current established kingdom of the European Caucasian. They say that the Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, controls the religion, and the United States of America controls the military. And together they operate as two separate powers moving towards the same agenda. Here we see that same essence with the Franks creating the political and religious, the political and militaristic aspect of it, while Charlemagne established the religious aspect of it. And that right there, that combination created the basis for what we see as far as European power goes. But side note, the Anglo-Saxons were originally two different peoples, the Angles and the Saxons, right? The Angles are the reason in which we have England, right? Angles land, or Angle land, was formed into or transitioned into England. So it went from Angle land to England, or England. We see this in the history of it. Damn, I didn't even upload that picture. Never mind it. The Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes conquered and settled Britain, seizing a key defensible, resource-rich island. However, they remained politically fragmented. This is key. They remained politically fragmented into separate kingdoms, right? And we see this being written about in Bede, Ecclesiastical History, right? But that separated into separate kingdoms, or that fragmented into separate kingdoms, is called a heptarchy. This establishes the raw material, right? The raw material, the ready strain and the sword, but it was not yet a unified force. So again, when we talk about the iron mixed with clay, we do have the iron. We do have the iron in some of these very strong, very dominant kingdoms that are emerging after the Roman Empire. However, we have the clay, where, like the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes, they are operating as separate kingdoms. They're so fragmented politically, and that's what makes them like clay rather than iron, because it's not unified, so it's not cohesive, right? Hopefully that makes sense to y'all. Going back to the Celts, the Celtic people, right? The Celts and the Gauls were a massive, widespread European population that served as the genetic link between the steppe tribes and the Mediterranean. Their tribes seized control of vast territories rich in resources such as gold and iron long before the Roman Empire. But the Roman and Greek accounts, it's important, the Roman and the Greek accounts noted the fair, ruddy complexion and fierce militarism of the Celtic tribes, confirming once again that Edomite physical marker and how it was broadly spread across Europe. Right. Let's take a look at this. Let's take a look at this from the worldhistory.edu. Right. Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul, history, significance, and other important facts. Generally revered as one of history's greatest military generals, Julius Caesar is best known for his conquest of the vast region of Gaul and later becoming dictator of Rome. Following conquest, Gaul was divided into Roman provinces. The Roman administration introduced Latin, engineering marvels like roads and aqueducts, and Roman law and culture. The Gauls adopted Roman customs, language, and religion, gradually blending their Celtic heritage with Roman elements. This process of Romanization did not erase Gaulish culture overnight, but transformed it over centuries into a unique Gallo-Roman identity. Right. So again, these Gauls were incorporated into the Roman society. They were Romanized or assimilated or converted, however you want to put it. It's all the same. But the Gauls, which were a people who were definitely noted as ruddy in complexion, were definitely noted as people who were fierce in their war, definitely noted as people who they could benefit from and associate with. Right? They were absorbed, so to speak, by Julius Caesar and the Romans. Right? Now let's start to deal with the servitude and the break. Right? Biblical foundation, dealing again with the prophecy that was spoken of in Genesis chapter 25, how the elder shall serve the younger. This prophecy required that the Edomite lineage be subject to the house of Jacob, which was the younger lineage, for a period of time and then rise to power. We see King David's conquest, where he imposed tribute on military occupation on Edom. In 2 Samuel chapter 8 and verse 14, establishing the initial yoke, right, where King David put garrisons in Edom. This servitude and the servitude was a necessary phase for the elder, that before the elder could prophetically break the yoke from off his neck, right? So we know that the prophecy says that, and some people harp on this. The Bible says that he's going to break the yoke up off his neck. Yeah, but he got to serve first, right? We understand that. And when did this happen? The medieval period, right? The medieval period saw the political and economic subjugation of the Edomite successor states by non-Caucasian empires, right? The Moorish rule from 711 CE to 1492. The Moorish conquest of Spain placed a key part of Western Europe under non-Caucasian rule for 800 years. Also dealing with the Ottoman conquest. The Ottoman Empire imposed a military and economic yoke over the Balkans and Southeast Europe, pressuring the Germanic heartland. Right? The oh man, I forgot about the Vikings. I placed this slide in the wrong spot, but the Viking invasions provided the external pressure necessary to consolidate the fragmented Germanic successor states into a singular militaristic power. So again, how we were talking about the Angles, the Jutes, the Saxons being not unified and being separate fragmented powers, the Vikings were actually the force in which caused that unification, right? We see that with the great heathen army. Vikings conquest forced the remaining kingdom of Wessex under Alfred the Great to unify the Anglo-Saxon strains into one nation, right? And again, this is where it goes back to talking about England being called England or Angloland. This is something that was is well documented in the history of England, right? And then the Danelaw, the legal and geographical partition formalized by the Treaty of Wedmore in 870 ACE, created the necessary military focus for unification. So again, we start to see these different Edomite powers that were separate and fragmented, such as the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, the Goths, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Vandals, and the Vikings, all now starting to be unified as one singular militaristic power known as the Great Heathen Army. Right. And if you look down below, or if you look over to the right, you'll start to see the paths and routes in which they took to start to dominate and take over this land known as England or England. The Norsemen, right? The Norsemen were the medieval sword. Again, now we're at about 800 to the 8th to 11th century CE. Right, the Viking expansion demonstrates the relentless military drive. The relentless, the relentless and military drive of the northern strain, right, the northern line between the collapse of Rome and the rise of the empires. They were the ultimate expression of the sword in the medieval period, right? Their lineage, which is known as the Normans, provided the key ruling house for the global British Empire, right? The definitive fulfillment of, you shall live by the sword was in these or during these dark ages. The Norman conquest in 1066 CE established the militaristic feudal foundations for the rise of British imperial power. So the Norsemen, also known as the Vikings, right, represent the purest expression of the "you shall live by the sword" blessing. I promise you. Their descendants conquered England in 1066 CE, installing a centralized militarized ruling class that provided the engine for the future British empires. And then again, going back to the Gothic kingdoms, right? Because now unified, the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths provided the immediate political and genetic inheritance of the Roman Empire, accelerating the spread of that military strain. With the seizing of Rome, they dismantled the Western Roman Empire. And then they founded powerful kingdoms in Spain and Italy, ensuring that the iron, right, according to the Daniel chapter 2, the iron and the ruddy strain were embedded as their new ruling class. Now, the Vandal kingdom, going back to their maritime dominion, right? I'm going backtracking just a little bit, but they provided a final aggressive link in the military succession, seizing the global resources and crippling the old power, right? They conquered Roman North African Carthage, and they immediately controlled the Mediterranean grains. But the reason why I wanted to come back to this, the reason why I wanted to come back to this was to show the map of the areas in which they had dominated, in which they had traveled, in which they had began to conquer, right? So again, if we're looking here, we start to see we see the kingdom of not only the Vandals, but the Alans as well, right? And then we see the kingdom of the Moors and the Romans down below during a different period. So the reason why I wanted to bring this map back around is because it's dealing with the different kingdoms of the world, not just the Vandals, but you also have the kingdom of the Visigoths up there, right? You also have the kingdoms of the Angles, right? All of these different kingdoms, and we see the pattern through and how in which the Vandals actually traveled, right? So now that unification has some visibility. They're going back and forth and traveling throughout these different kingdoms and regions of Edomite peoples, right? And rallying up that unification. Bringing us to the Habsburg dynasty, right? The dynastic apex of the empire. The Habsburg dynasty, they were the ruling class or the ruling dynasty that unified the fragmented Germanic successor states, consolidating the Edomite lineage's power. They controlled the Holy Roman Empire. So we see that the Franks helped establish it, but the Habsburg dynasty actually controlled it for centuries, linking the Frankish Germanic legacy to the global colonial age, right? So the Franks then passed on the control of the Holy Roman Empire to their successors, which were the Habsburgs. Their rule represented the maximum consolidation of the iron power and the military force, again, referencing Daniel chapter 2, because although we like to dive into the history, and I think that we're, doing it to a great extent, we also have to continue to include the prophecy in there. So that way, that this is not just secular. This is biblical, baby. All right. Now, the prophetic conflict dealing with the Spanish conquest. The Habsburg executed the prophetic conflict against the younger brothers' dispersed nations. And by the younger brother, I'm talking about Jacob. The Spanish Habsburgs directed the Edomite sword against the indigenous peoples of the Northern Kingdom, as we see. It's also referred to as Arcerith in the Bible and in the Encyclopedia Britannica, right? Which commenced the final pursuit. Right, we see this play out in with the Spanish Armada in 1588. This campaign that they went on targeted England, a nation identified as another branch of the Northern Kingdom's descendants. Damn, this is crazy, right? This dynasty, the Habsburg dynasty, unified the Spanish Empire with the Holy Roman Empire, and this control fueled the Spanish conquest of the Americas, right? So they were the engine that combined their wealth with Spain and with the military might of Central Europe, and then their actions represent the first massive global fulfillment of the Edomite lineage, directly using its sword against the younger brother's descendants on an intercontinental scale, meaning that up until this point, up until the time of the Habsburgs, so in the 1500s, there had not been an intercontinental attack of the Israelites by the Edomites, right? They literally traveled all the way across the world in pursuit of their younger brother, Jacob. This is the first time that we had seen that. So again, this is key, because not only did they do that, but they helped fuel and build the Holy Roman Empire, combining it with the Spanish Empire. And this is what fueled the conquests of America. Right? The modern dynastic link, right? Victoria and Wilhelm II. Queen Victoria, from, as old as she was. She was a representative of the final political state of the Anglo-Saxon and Norman lineage in the British Empire. This is a well-known fact. This is documented, right? Her reign oversaw the peak fulfillment of the fatness of the earth through colonial expansion. Up under her wing, she saw the extent and the, how do I want to say? She saw the growth of the empire and the expansion of the empire at its peak, right? At its peak, and the fulfillment of it to the ceiling of where it is and where it can be, right? During her time and during her reign. Patrilineally speaking, right, which is her lineage through her father, it traces back through the Anglo-Saxon and the Norman conquests, right, which serves as the ultimate modern representative of the lineage, which means that with us tying the Edomites all the way up into the Anglo-Saxons and the Normans, and then having the Queen Victoria of the British Empire linking directly back to them through her father, directly puts the ruling class of the British Empire in the lineage of the Edomites. Kaiser Wilhelm, right, which is a representative of the final military state of the Germanic Frankish lineage, the Holy Roman Empire and Russia. His dynasty, Hohenzollern, embodied the German military machine, the ultimate modern fulfillment of the sword prophecy, right? His rule led directly to World War I. I'm going to repeat that. Say that one more time. His rule led directly to World War I. Doesn't get much clearer than this, man. But don't worry, we're almost there. Now we're diving into the latter day prophecies, right? The transatlantic slave trade, fulfilling the prophecy on a global scale. The Edomite aligned powers execute the final massive act of servitude against the house of Jacob, the house of Judah, through the transatlantic slave trade, where they sold millions, hundreds of millions, millions of millions. No, I'm just kidding. But they sold millions of Jacob's descendants into bondage into the Western Hemisphere, right? This act provided the ultimate global fulfillment of selling the children of Israel into servitude, as we read in Joel chapter 3 and verse number 6, right? You could look at historical maps that reference Negro land and the documentation of the European trade companies. Like, it's all of the information is there, right? As well as I have a map down below which shows the trade routes of the time of the transatlantic slave trade, right? And through route number 4, the purple, and route number 9, the orangish red, you can see that there was a selling of enslaved peoples along with the goods, sugar, and molasses. So you have the northern kingdom, you have the southern kingdom, the house of Judah, being sold into slavery through the transatlantic slave trade. And then you have the sword being applied to and utilized in attack of the northern kingdom all the way over here to the other side of the world in Arsareth, right? So for those of you that don't know, you could, or don't hold to the Apocrypha, you could read that in the book of 2nd Ezra chapter 13. So this in itself, through the 16th and the 19th century, helps draw that connection on top of all of the genetic evidence that we provided. But notice that the transatlantic slave trade and the correlation to this current servitude happened around the 1500s, right? But there's a reason for that, and we're going to get to that in a second. The final political structure of the Edomite dominion, modern Europe powers, is defined by prophetic instability, right? The iron and the clay, which is their military strength, the Edomite strain, is mixed with the fragility, the non-cohesive elements, and the inherent instability, right? We see several instances throughout the lineages that we've addressed where they have that instability. When you look at their kingdom, their reign, their ruling time periods, their classes, their clashes, they were very short, very brief. Their successions were taken over immediately, which were then taken over immediately by someone else. There were fightings and rumblings within those nations and kingdoms and people where they were murdering one another for political gain. Very unstable. Right. This is why the Vandals played a very big part in the unification of it. The Vikings played a very big part in the unification of them, but however, it wasn't an ultimate unification. We see even now today they're still not as connected and cohesive as they would like to be, even though they're all the same people. But dealing with the statistics of their instability, right? Just to prove it, even now to this day, you have the Eurozone, which faces persistent debt crises, such as Greece, Italy, right? Challenging its political and economic unity. You have the divided military power, which NATO's reliance on the U.S. and chronic underfunding by member states demonstrate a fractured military iron, not to mention the Chinese are taking over. You have the Russians, who are also Edomite people, fighting and warring against the Americans, or the Americas, which stem from the British, for the British Empire, which are also Edomite people, fighting against one another. So this is further proof that goes to that instability, that clay. And then you have the political disunion, right? The rise of strong nationalist movements such as Brexit, such as Catalonian separatism, and it proves the political clay cannot permanently mix. Man, we could drop the mic at this point, but we're going to keep it going, right? Dealing with the beast and the bottomless pit, right? Because it is referenced a lot. So I'll read the verse and then I'll dive into how it is valid. Revelation chapter 20, verses 1-3. And I saw an angel come down from heaven, having the key to the bottomless pit and the great chain in his hand. And he laid hold on the dragon, that old serpent, which is the devil and Satan, and bound him 1,000 years, and cast him into the bottomless pit, and shut him up, and set a seal upon him, that he should deceive the nations no more, till the 1,000 years should be fulfilled. And after that, he must be loosed a little season, right? So it's very, very symbolic. But it also attests to Genesis chapter 25, where it talks about the elder serving the elder serving the younger, and then there's a time period in which he is subjected and subdued, and then he breaks the yokes. So again, that final judgment, it involves economic ruin and spiritual desolation, and the Edomite power center, right? The beast, Edomite power. Very simple. Represents the ultimate political and military dominion carried by the lineage, right? And that bottomless pit, which is Europe and which is Europe and its territories, or the continent in itself, symbolizes the final economic desolation of the ruling territory, and it deals with the depletion of the natural resources within the land, within the continent itself. This Edomite lineage has experienced historical reversals of the fatness of the earth mandate. It has happened, right? It has happened where that yoke has been placed on their neck, where that chain has been placed about them, and they have been cast into the bottomless pit. It has happened, right? And when we look at the collapse of the Roman economy and infrastructure into the literal economic pit, that's one instance. In the medieval period, economic isolation and depletion caused by the dominance of non-Caucasian empires, trade empires at that, such as the Moors, such as the Ottomans, as we covered a little bit earlier, that serves as a metaphoric pit, right? But let's dive a little bit more deeply into that and get into it, because this is the historical millennial period, right? Where the dragon is bound from about 500 CE to about 1500 CE, which sounds like 1,000 years to me, right? The binding started with the fall of the Roman iron in 476 CE and the establishment of the Moorish Ottoman yokes over the European nations. The bottomless pit, which is Europe, goes into economic and technological crippling, such as the dark, which is termed or coined as the Dark Ages. And then in about 1300 CE, the European nations remained politically and economically suppressed by the dominant Islamic caliphates, right? Then in about 1500, 1492-ish, you know what I'm saying? The release or the break begins with the Renaissance and the Age of Discovery, launching the final imperial age, from which we transition into such things as the transatlantic slave trade, and so on and so forth. Everything that has transpired from then till now, right? Looking at the book of Revelation, chapter 12, right, dealing with the dragon, we see that the Herodian dynasty is like one fulfillment of it, right? Because, immediately after the Roman Empire, we see that the Herodian dynasty had a pursuit of the children of Israel, right? By attempting to murder Christ, and the perpetual enmity, which we see them continuing to chase after the seed of Israel, even all the way over here to the other side of the world, with the Northern Kingdom and Arsareth and the transatlantic slave trade and all of the things that we've covered. So just showing how the lineage that we're speaking about, the Edomite lineage, the Caucasian lineage, they fit this to a T on multiple different levels and facets, right? Book of Obadiah, chapter 1 and verse 4. It says, though thou exalt thyself as an eagle, and though thou set thy nest among the stars, thence will I bring thee down, saith the Lord. When we look at the Space Force, when we look at their aerospace sciences, when we look at their technological advances, when it comes to space exploration, this is them exalting themselves as an eagle and setting their nest among the stars. But again, this is something that they have always looked to do, especially when we look at the history, such as Petra, right? Where they have always tried to have a high dwelling place, an exalted dwelling place. But the Lord says that he will bring them down. Look at this. 25 years in orbit. 280 different astronauts have visited this satellite. That's crazy. That's crazy. Far-fetched. But you see the different vehicles in which they utilize to explore these explore this space, quote unquote, to lift themselves up, to take themselves high as an eagle and exalt themselves, further fitting the prophecy. And then you got the institutional thread of the eagle symbol. Oh my. Right, the Roman Aquila, the Holy Roman Empire got the double-headed eagle, the Napoleonic eagle, right? The United States bald eagle, the vexillology. Oh my God. Vexillology, and heraldry records, right? That's where you can find these things. But the constant widespread use of the eagle as a symbol of supreme, aggressive, world-ruling authority across every power transition provides a direct, non-negotiable visual and institutional fulfillment of Obadiah's prophecy, right? They also use this symbol for lands that they've conquered, right? The Byzantine Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, the Seljuk Empire, the Empire of Trebizond, right? The Habsburg monarchy, which we covered a couple slides ago, the Serbian Empire, the King of Mysore, right? The League of Lezi, right? The Tsardom of Russia, Russian Empire. The list goes on, right? And this is just a few. This is just a few. Further drawing to that conclusion, that these different people groups, right, fulfill not only prophetically, right, but patrilineally fulfill the descendancy of the Edomites, right? And last but not matter of fact, one more thing. I'll get to it afterwards. The Edomite lineage, right? In conclusion, the Edomite lineage carried the three defining prophetic markers across, that's a typo. It's supposed to be about 12,500 years of history to the current day, right? The identity, right? Number one, which is the red readiness, the red complexion, the readiness, the hair all over, right? This is traced from Genesis chapter 25 to the Scythians. Oh, almost forgot. Speaking of the Scythians, since we've had such an uproar in regards to Paul and Gentile to the salvations, salvation to the Gentiles. Let's take a look at something real quick in the book of Colossians chapter 3. Right. Colossians chapter 3 and verse number 9. Do not lie one to another, since you have taken off the old self with its practices. You have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge in the image of its creator, right? So again, you put on this new you. You put on this new you, and it's being renewed in the knowledge and the image of its creator. So the knowledge of the new you and the image of the new you is supposed to be in the likeness of the Most High, right? Here, in that knowledge and in that image, there is no Greek nor Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave or free. But Christ is in all, including the Scythian, is all, and is in all, including the Scythian, which we just traced back to the Edomites. So for those who don't believe in what is about to be presented, you have some explaining to do. You got some explaining to do. All right? Why would Paul say that if it wasn't true? Why would Paul exercise his liberty to express that, utilizing the example of a lineage of people that directly links back to the Edomites. I'm going to leave that there. But again, we've tracked these three prophetic markers. The identity, which is traced from Genesis chapter 25 to the Scythians, to the Goths, to the Saxons, to so on and so forth. The blessing of the sword, which was traced from Mount Seir to Macedonia, to Rome, to the Viking and the Norman conquest and the global imperial age. The servitude, which was traced from, King David's conquest through the Moorish Ottoman Empire to the ultimate break of the yoke in 1500 CE or around, right? And then you have the every major event, right, from the Assyrian tribute to the transatlantic slave trade fits into this structure, this final stage, where we now have an identity for who Esau is. We have not left any stone unturned. And that's the goal. That's been the goal. So, Most High willing, this was very, very edifying for you. If you did not know or have not ever heard of these people groups or were not aware of who they were, historically speaking, hopefully now you have an idea. And if you have some more information that you'd like to add, feel free. Go ahead. This is food for thought. And this is for you to go ahead and find information to add onto it. Right? But with that, I want to give all praise, honor, and glory to the Most High God, Yahweh. I do so by Hashem Yahushai and say Shalom.
Mr. Killer, Killer, Killer. Mr. Killer, Killer, Killer. Yeah. Gotta be a killer. What you gotta do for what you want. I'm talking about necessarily telling nobody, right? But you gotta get them to get happy. Let them talk. Be a killer. What you do. Nobody stop.
Mr. Killer, Killer, Killer. Yeah, nigga, I kill him. Show no mercy or feeling. Nothing very revealing. People say that I'm illin' like pass them the penicillin. The wall giving me limits. The sky is my ceiling to die for what I'm living. Lord knows I'm about that. I'll be right back and come back with a nice strap. Till I collapse, I be hated until I'm buried. And even after that, these hating niggas still scary. It's so much to live for, so much to kill for, so much to destroy, so much to see grow.
Let's continue. Because it's simple, it's plain, it's real clear, cut, and dry. But we're going to dive into it and get some more evidences for the non-believers.